Hi, everybody, and welcome to another great episode of the IAC, the Infrastructure as Code podcast. My name is Ohad Meislish, and today we have an amazing, well-known, experienced, uh, couldn't think of any better guest to have today, Patrick Debois. Hi, Patrick. Welcome.
Well, thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here. I hope you're not moving anytime soon. I see boxes behind you, but
I'm not moving. My wife is an interior designer, so I don't know what's going on. Every now and then I see some stuff behind me, and she fixes some things to her customers and offices. So I guess this is yet another
how's that
project.
re-architecturing?
I stopped asking to be to be honest.
That's fair.
Cool. Patrick, for those who might not know you still, please present yourself and your impressive background.
Yeah, I think most people know me from my work around DevOps and then in extension DevSecOps. I had the pleasure of accidentally starting DevOps Days in 2009 and never knew this was going to be an industry thing. Always help like new people, new technologies kind of bring along. And kind of that's, I've seen quite some trends growing over what's now like 15 years and kind of move ahead. And recently I've kind of looking more into AI as a different way of automating, like what we've been doing for 50 years and kind of how it can help us. So again, I'm community. I try to be as technical as I can, and I try to be, somehow of management as well, a leader, both in community and companies. So that's in a nutshell what people know me from.
Perfect. So DevOps Days, we all obviously attended numerous of these events worldwide. I remember my first DevOps Days. It was in 2013. So it took me a few years to start getting into those, but it's an honor to talk with the creator of DevOps Days. And if we talk about the days of the DevOps engineers, I think it has changed throughout the years what those DevOps engineers need to do. I often talk about that. I think one of the key skills of the DevOps engineers in the last decade was obviously to know the cloud providers. So you need to be an expert in AWS or in Azure or GCP or maybe others, and to manage that infrastructure properly. And I often talk about how the days of the DevOps engineers change in the way of infrastructure as code, because they no longer just need to know about AWS, they also need to know about the code that represents the cloud resources, whether it's for the infrastructure, let's say Terraform or CloudFormation or things like that, or in more the middleware, specifically about Kubernetes, knowing Kubernetes YAML and Helm. But besides these technologies, I think a lot of processes and concepts have been, let's say, evolving throughout years. So what have you seen, not just about the technologies that those DevOps engineers using during their days, but what have you seen in the approach, in the concept, in the processes for those engineers in their work?
Yeah. So it's good that you mentioned that. A lot of people forget around DevOps, it is, as much tools than it is process and collaboration as such, right?
Exactly.
And I think, in 2009, the cloud was indeed emerging, and this kind of brought agility to things. We were able to spin up new environments much faster. And that created the tension, and that is called it, initially that was the DevOps days, the tension of teams releasing, but like wanted to deploy faster on-prem, which is currently kind of on its way back, but on-prem. And then in the cloud, they were able to do this much faster. So kind of that was, not a coincidence, but kind of a collaboration between the two kind of movements there happening. in the old days, we were having big groups of developers and big groups of ops and kind of throwing things over the wall, as we used to say. I think over the years that has changed, a lot, thanks to things like Spotify and Netflix and kind of, the whole you build it, you run it with a kind of more separate team and feature teams. So that kind of moved part of the complexity to the teams themselves. So you could say, if you move that to a team, does everybody need to be the expert, right? That's the one thing, in the beginning, everybody was asking. So are we all now doing all the things at the same time?
It's never possible to have everybody expert in so many different things. It's always too big of a struggle.
Yeah, but what helps is that, and that's part of, if you've done the job in some capacity, whether that was beginner and not, you start understanding the pain. So you have the empathy that if somebody else solves it for you, they also have a hard time like solving it, whether that was coding or kind of like building the infrastructure, the hardware, or the networking there as well. So kind of having that affinity. And I think it was no kind of coincidence that the early first DevOps days, there were people somewhere in their, let's say, early mid-30s and 40s, because they felt the pain and they've been a little bit further along the route, and they understood they kind of had to collaborate between the two worlds. Because it's important to understand the pain. If you've never experienced the pain, it feels like something you kind of don't know, right? I still see people writing scripts, as we were doing automation before everything of the infrastructure as code. So
Definitely.
that's just going to stay as such. And I think what, the whole movement, maybe, there was kind of Bfrog, the invention, Chef, but we moved along kind of the whole way toward like Terraform and then further Pulumi. And so there were like different paradigms of people, in my belief, solving the same problem. And the paradigms are important if you do any kind of automation. Part of having good automation is that the automation actually adapts to the mental model of the user of the automation. So if you are more config-centric, you go to YAML files. If you're more coding-centric, you want to express it in code. There was a lot of debate, like if one is better than the other. But, in my, insight, it's just a matter on what's your view of the world and how you think about solving this kind of automation. And that's why it's so nice that there is like different ways we can solve this now. And the additional part is that we kind of are more standardized. It's not Bob's script in this directory. So we're kind of reusing part of the abstraction layers and bringing that into the cloud, making that just an API call away, also made that possible, right? You could not do this without it being an API and make it more robust there. So that's kind of like how people change. You do kind of like from, first more like script based, and then they kind of started doing more of the code, and then they wouldn't config again, and now we see it more code. It doesn't matter. Like I've used probably them all over my career, and you can express A with B, and there's always like the one itch that they kind of bring you in. But as such, pick your poison, I would say.
Sure. And in the last few years, beside these different technologies and approaches, we have seen a lot of efforts being done in order to empower developers and to give them more freedom and capabilities to run fast, but on the other hand, not to create any damage to the application, to the production environment. And so you need some concepts of how you empower them, but still remain with centralized governance that doesn't slow them down. And one of the things we started to see is that there are people that really care and have their personal goal in the companies to empower developers and to build the right platforms for them to be able to do that. So what do you see from your experience that is happening today? Let's say about maybe focus the conversation on specifically the concept of platform engineering, and maybe also talk about IDPs such as Backstage. So what do you see that is happening here, and why?
So I think the difference between early days, the non-cloud and the cloud, we could have used the same tools, right? I think what tipped it is that we were moving to self-servicing automation at that time. So kind of, I want an instant environment, I can get this. And then I think that we kept building on top of that. Well, if it's just an API call away, can we build an interface for the developers? Can we kind of bring them on board to do it themselves? Again, that self-servicing aspect that was so important. So we tried to abstract things away. That it was not too hard to do, but we cannot, like we mentioned before, we cannot expect them to be experts as such. And that's why we still had another team who were the experts. Hey, it's the same thing whether we have a team that is specialized in identity services. Hey, they're the expert. So we kind of built that kind of a platform team around that was able to help them and was able to build that in self-servicing. Recently, there's been a lot of calls on self-servicing is one thing. We're offering this to kind of the developers, but the way we're asking and seeing what they need is not just we're offering this to them. It's something they have to use. So we're treating more and more who's using the service of the platform team as a product. We're offering services, and the only way that services can survive and that we can kind of quote, quote, make money out of this and deserve the money that we're being spent on is when people are starting to use this. Obviously, there's companies who kind of like, force you to use the platform. We're trying to steer away from that because when we learn, if we make it the good way and the right way, we want them to use that. And that's also where we want to put the guardrails, because we cannot spend the energy of putting guardrails everywhere, but we can do that in a way that, if this is the standard way, we can help you along the path. And there's a lot of goodies that you bring in that you don't have to worry about there as well. So kind of developers perceive this as, hey, I can spin this up. I don't need to ask the ops person. If if something fails, I can still call the ops person. It's the same thing with AWS. You're not like, you could think it's just an API away, but you're paying them a support contract to still be able to talk to them. So it's very similar, but you're just doing this internally. And then that kind of brought the whole thing on not just providing infrastructure and cloud pieces, but what about we bring also a system that if you have microservices that other developers can find the other microservice. Well, right? That's not necessarily the infra part. It's a little bit higher in the abstraction layer in the APIs, or the documentation services. So kind of those things slowly moved indeed into the internal developer platform team that kind of brought a little bit of a higher level of abstraction with blueprints for the code. This is how we do kind of like error handling in the code. This is how we do kind of add the observability to the code. So kind of all those practices kind of went up. One of the things that I do notice is that developers love a standard way and they hate it a standard way if it gets in their way. So so kind of that's why you have to listen it as a product, but it's also tough because you might have 15 opinions of different developers on the solutions. But as any company, and you know that if you want to start, you cannot comply to all customers. You have to see where the majority is helping, what makes sense, and where you can help them the most. The rest, you can support them, but it's a different way of collaboration, and they might kind of have to need like a special care. They're helping, a lot of people have moved that into developer productivity. From a developer platform, we're going to make sure that, they can kind of be productive as much as they want. If they need it, it's instantly there, need the debugging. But that kind of tied a little bit, hey, if you're doing all this, you build it, you run it, you have to take responsibilities. You have to look at your log files. You have to look at your errors. You have to look at the infrastructure.
Day two operations. Yeah, it's not just you release it and then it's somebody's else's problem. No.
Indeed. And you can't escape that complexity, right? So you can say, well, here's the platform, run it. But, then you have to run it. So that's kind of hard for them. And then there's, in my belief, been some misconceptions. And if you think about governance, imagine you're a company and you say, well, every team's allowed to choose whatever they want because we want them to be most productive that they want. Imagine we have 15 different programming languages, 5 ways of doing databases, 12 ways of doing this. It does not make sense. So that pendulum, I believe, has, in many companies, moved a little bit too much into, kind of, that was good. I don't think we're in that economic climate anymore where we could do this. So we have to build more scrutiny on there. So that's kind of like a pendulum going back. While, it's also guardrails on what of the standards you do, not guardrails on the deployment and the testing, but also kind of guardrails on organizational structures and impact and cost and kind of all those things that you have to balancing in before you can make decisions on software as well.
Thank you. And in addition to that, what do you expect that AI will affect these processes and maybe other processes? Do you see a connection between those two?
Well, AI can help in finding information quicker. It could suggest part of our code. On the collaboration part, it could be about, we're going to monitor and maybe inform people better when things change. I often give the example as, as VP engineering, I set certain standards on things we should do. I do not have the capacity to nag you all the time on, hey, for compliance reasons, you need to do A and B, right? But kind of those things, if you have a personal assistant that will help you, like everything you do, and it kind of helps you to understand why this is not a good idea and why you should not be doing it, that would save me a lot of time. Obviously, I'm talking now from a different role. I'm not talking about the perspective of the developer. But then on the same hand, that developer does not want to be notified when it's in production. They are scared. They do not want to make those kind of failures as well. And AI can help us with kind of dealing with issues in our code, our configs, look at the logs, and help us much more even compared to the automation we used to have. Is it perfect? No. So we still need the humans to kind of understand whether it gave the right advice and not the wrong advice. So you cannot blindly accept those kind of automations that AI is suggesting. But it definitely speeds up a lot of sifting, a lot of nagging, and a lot of communication that we can bring in the work that we're already doing.
And if I wanted to ask you to take a guess, what's going to happen? What's going to change going forward in the next 5 or 10 years? How do you think the work of those maybe DevOps engineers or maybe platform engineers, what do you think is going to be different for them today versus 10 years from now?
It's like looking in a crystal ball, right? But it's, let's take the path where AI keeps being on the rise.
Okay.
If we're doing more automation through AI, like we've been doing before, what we're now seeing is that the role of a developer actually is becoming a manager and almost like an ops person. It's like
I wanted to say an orchestrator.
Yeah, or a manager or a CEO of agents, or they kind of like supervising and reviewing things as they get, right? So it's a different skill from producing to managing in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't believe the producing is going to go away, so we'll still have to understand. And I've made the parallel before on when we did the automation of infrastructure as code. We had to have CI/CD testing. That was the guardrails to keep it in check, more tests. And then we moved into resilience engineering because we wanted to have, when things fail, we wanted to fail like nicely. I think that's with AI, we want to see that as well. When AI did something and it did not complete, we want to make sure that it is like failing nicely and it's built into the design that it's allowed to fail. Then we move up, and similar to kind of, thoughts on resilience engineering, when you become the operator and you review a lot of the code, the next thing is that if you don't produce all the time, you have to train to understand when things fail. So whatever time we put in there, and it's almost like this was chaos engineering, like it was deliberately pulling things down. So we got better at dealing with failure again, the ones we automate. So kind of that maybe becomes like more of a learning. And that's I think where we're moving. We might think that the automation will save us a lot of time with the AI, but it's like 20% of the time, and 80% we're going to spend on keeping it in check and making sure it's well designed. You can skip all those steps, as many have done with test skipping and kind of like, more robust environments, but eventually that will bite you. So I think there's something to be there that, AI will help us, and now we have to kind of make sure it's more fail-safe. We deal way better with the exceptions. And so there's a trend, I think, if that kind of automation continues, that we're on that path as well.
Yep, makes a lot of sense. Patrick, I think with that, we're going to finish today's session. And, thinking about the evolution of those engineers, I started coding 25 years ago, and I remember even writing assembly code to work directly with the CPU in DOS. Not just Microsoft and Linux. I also wrote code to run on DOS. Don't ask me why.
So
we need to have, we needed to have the skills to know the how everything really works, all the way to the CPU at some occasions. We didn't have any open source packages and frameworks to use, so very often a lot of the code we've written are like basic concepts that should be used repeatedly in other places, whether it's to send messages or queuing or emails or some backoff mechanisms. I remember things that are very non-unique to your business. So we needed to do things and to produce, as you said, we had to produce everything. And now we're talking about getting mature, produced packages, and we need to manage and orchestrate and to navigate it. So many different options that we already have. And the skill is not to produce, but to use those smartly and effectively. So that's like a total different approach to what it means to become an effective engineer in general, not just DevOps or platform. Any engineer should look around, see what you can utilize. No need to build from scratch things. You probably already exist out there. And the pace of that is dramatically increasing in so many directions. Awesome.
But the fun thing is, if you know somebody who understands what goes on below the abstraction, that's your friend, right? So when
I from time to time you need to talk with that person. Yeah. You cannot avoid it. Awesome. Thank you, Patrick, so much for a lovely session today. I deeply appreciate your time, and thanks to all of our listeners for listening to another episode at the IAC podcast. And see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.